Welcome. William Loren Katz is the author of Black Indians, A Hidden Heritage, and 40 other books on African American history. His books have won awards, and his research, writing, and lectures have earned widespread praise from noted scholars such as John Hope Franklin, Henry Louis Gates, Jr., John Henrik Clarke, Howard Zinn, Alice Walker, and Cornel West, to name a few. He is an acclaimed lecturer who has spoken at more than 50 universities and dozens of museums and libraries. The renowned historian joins me to discuss the original version of his book and its revised edition, both of which are available on Amazon.com. It's an honor to welcome you to the show, Mr. Katz.
Pleasure to be on with you, Gary.
Let me begin by asking, what served as the catalyst for writing Black Indians?
Well, I'm laughing because it's a kind of long story, and I have to make it short. I was a high school teacher, 14 years, New York City, and in Lower Westchester. And I also grew up in a household in which my father, during the Great Depression, acquired an enormous interest in jazz music and blues. And he began to collect records, and he was politically active, so he tried to help organizations like the United Negro and Allied Veterans of America raise money through running jazz concerts and so on. So I was a kid who also went to sleep listening to jazz music and woke up because my father was very interested, not just in the music, but who the heck made this, he said, with books he gathered on African American history. So I came with that. And when I went into teaching after getting my bachelor's and master's degree, I've found, of course, the schools did nothing about it. Matter of fact, I had to bootleg material into the classrooms. And Black Indians specifically, of my 40 books, grew out of a book I wrote called The Black West, which fascinated me because, like any kids growing up in America at that time, I'm fascinated by Westerns. And here was I stumbling on dozens upon dozens upon dozens of not only individual men and women, but even black towns out west that I never saw in any of the movies. And I'm gathering material on that, and I'm gathering pictures, because I always like to tell my story in pictures. And lo and behold, a number of the pictures that I'm gathering showing black men and women out west also are showing Native Americans with them. And it begins to dawn on me, there's a whole other story here that has never been told about the relationship on the frontier between white people and Native Americans and African Americans. So that's how I got to it, and I've been continuing.
The book was originally published in the late 80s, correct?
Yes, 1986.
And how does the revised edition differ?
First of all, you have to understand that the original edition was designed for young adults. Therefore, had to limit it in certain ways. Had to be very clear. It couldn't use footnotes. Couldn't use all kinds of heavy scholarly material. I had to limit it to less than 200 pages and so on and so on. I had to leave out a lot with those kind of limitations. So what I just jumped at the chance on the 25th anniversary of the book. It was doing very well, all on its own, by the way. Not many reviews, but word of mouth and selling on the streets here in New York on 6th Avenue, all the way up to 125th Street in Harlem. Booksellers out there with their little tables. So I was able to add an enormous amount of material to it and bring it up to date to things that I hadn't covered in the early history, showing how black and red people had reached out to each other in the 60s, in the 70s, 80s, up, into the new century. I kind of filled in a lot of the things left out and put in a lot of new things. I was able to talk about the American Indian movement and how in the civil rights movement of Dr. King, Native Americans were involved. In Dr. Farrakhan's March on Washington, Million Man March. He had Native American speakers as well as African Americans, and even the relationship that developed by prisoners Leonard Peltier and Mumia Abu-Jamal. So it really brought it up to date, which people wanted. They didn't just want the history that in the original edition I had traced all the way back to the days of Columbus.
Were black Indians separate from tribes like the Apache, Comanche, and Sioux, or were they included amongst them?
Well, that's the whole thing. They were both. But what I wrote about, what people didn't know, is that they were included in just about all of the nations that were here. And the reason was simple. I found out, and this is one of the central points people are kind of shocked about. The first people enslaved here in the Americas were not Africans but Native Americans. The Europeans who arrived they enslaved whoever they found. And they, of course, made war on Native Americans, and they overworked them. They were beginning to not die out, but they were beginning to die on the job from overwork, persecution, savage treatment, and so on. Africans were brought in as replacements, and also the Africans had one further advantage. Native Americans could escape and go back to their own people who were armed and often in secure hiding places, villages, and so on. And Africans could always be designated by their skin color. They had nobody to automatically reach out to who was sympathetic, except that because the Europeans had enslaved Native Americans first, Native Americans got the idea that when they peeked over those hedges and saw black people and white people, they saw a cleavage in what was going on there. Black people were working, they were oppressed, they were unhappy, and white people were profiting from them, taking advantage of them, and so on. So it doesn't take too long to put together the idea that the enemy of your enemy is your friend. And that's how it developed. And I trace it back to 1502, when Governor Ovando of Hispaniola, the island of Haiti and Dominican Republic today, found as Africans were escaping to Native Americans, and he wrote to King Ferdinand as he set out in search of them, and never could be recaptured. And I found in those 3 or 4 words his saying that something is going on out there beyond the Spanish settlements. Something is going on. Native Americans are taking them in, and which is exactly what I found as I researched it, and they were becoming sister and brother, husband and wife, mother and father, so on.
In what part of the country were they primarily located?
Yeah, that's a very important question. It was primarily east here along the eastern seaboard, along the 5 civilized, they were called civilized, nations of the southeast. And Africans from Georgia and the Carolinas, Mississippi, and so on, fled and were taken in by these nations. And particularly in the Seminoles, well, the Seminoles are the largest concentration that I've found of black Indians, because Florida was originally settled primarily by people of African descent who fled bondage in the Carolinas and headed south to live their own free life. And around the time of 1776, the American Revolution, the Seminole people among the Creek Nation, fearing some kind of unjust treatment, broke from the Creeks, headed south, and the Africans took them in. And the Africans who took them in were from Senegambia and Sierra Leone, Africa, and they taught the Seminoles methods of rice cultivation that they had learned in their African homeland. And on this basis, the 2 peoples of color formed a agricultural and military alliance that fought slave catchers and held the United States Army, Navy, and Marines at bay for 42 years. They got along fine. Every effort was made to crack that alliance. It held up. It was the longest and most sustained and bloodiest battle against Native Americans until that time in American history.
Were they easily distinguishable from slaves in the U.S.?
Well, they were distinguishable by color, but the important thing is that when the two people began to meet, they found something else that was just fascinating. They found that they had a lot in common. They were both spiritual, and they believed the environment was part of both of their lives, and they should protect it. Mountains and hills represented spirits and divinities. People, animals, and plants carried life's messages. Religion was not just for Sunday, but a matter of daily reflection. That was distinctly different from what either people had in comparison to the Europeans. And this brought them together. They wanted to live harmoniously with nature, accepted economies that stressed cooperative subsistence agriculture rather than competition and a search for gold and wealth at each step. They really were on a different plane together than the Europeans were with either of them. You had slaveholders who found that the people who worked for them and who they enslaved had escaped. They went into Indian villages. They sometimes could distinguish who they were, but they also tried to lay claim to whoever in the village looked like he was of African descent. And the Indians learned that if the only way they could end the argument as a winner was by claiming that the African people they were pointing to was now, quote, my slave. In other words, that it wasn't yours. I had enslaved this person, which of course was the story they made up to protect them, because the only thing the Europeans respected was property and claims of property.
In online and print interviews, you stated there were numerous sad and tragic events that had a devastating impact on Black Indians and their culture. Could you provide a few examples for those who might not be aware of what happened?
Racial hatred didn't grow on this soil. I have so many instances in the book of Europeans, whether it's French, British, Dutch, saying we must pit these people against each other. And part of it made sense from the European standpoint because, first of all, the Europeans coming over here were constantly, in the early days, outnumbered. And here they have two peoples of color they're trying to exploit. So they're both exploiting them, but they also need to play divide and rule. And then that's what they did. They went after them in that way. So it was a tragic experience because at times they were able to pit black people against red people and so on. But the alliance held. I mean, that's the kind of the theme of my book. Even though there were instances, the alliance held. In instance after instance, the Europeans are driven to sputtering fury at the thought that Native Americans won't return the Africans who fled to them. And as a matter of fact, one of the interesting things I found was in the early treaties that were signed between the Europeans and the Native Americans, there was always a section saying that escaped slaves must be returned. They had to agree to it, and in no instance was there ever found to be an instance where they were returned, because by then they were being asked to return members of their family, their children, their wives, and so on.
They say that the millions of people who came to and eventually settled in America changed it for the better. What would you say was the greatest contribution of the Black Indians?
I'm glad you asked that question because I have an answer. I call the Black Indians our first freedom fighters. Just think of what process I described. Africans fleeing to Indians, the two people arming to fight for what? For their freedom and their sovereignty and their land. And I'm talking about something, as I said, that goes back to the time of Columbus, not in 1776. By then, they've been doing it for centuries, fighting for freedom. And that contribution, you can't take that away. That's far superior to what happened in 1776, when a group of 55 men put on white wigs, they were largely slaveholders, met in Philadelphia and declared, quote, all men are created equal. Black Indians, both the Native Americans among them, and the Africans and the Black Indian blending of the two, were fighting for freedom on their own, as I said, centuries before then.
I have one more question, and it's pretty detailed, so bear with me. There's been a great deal of debate on the issue of immigration during past presidential elections and the upcoming election as well. What makes the 2016 presidential election differ is the fact that you have a Republican nominee and many members of said party proclaiming certain people should be kicked out of or refuse access to the country because they don't belong here. When examining the history of Black Indians in America and how they were treated, what points would you cite from your book to challenge the viewpoints of Donald Trump and those who support his position on immigration?
Well, I mean, I think the position that he has enunciated is wrong on so many levels. I just take a few separate instances. Native Americans alone not only welcomed the European newcomers, but they taught them all kinds of things that allowed them to survive. If the Native Americans had just walked away when the Europeans landed, the Europeans would have been lost. They wouldn't have known how to fish, where to fish, what poisons to look out for, and what kind of foods to cultivate, and so on. And of course, Africans coming among the Native Americans taught them many things. And the Europeans took an approach which was exploitative. They wanted to use the people. They wanted to seize their land. They wanted to enslave men and women, husband and wife, and children. And the Europeans who came, as I said, also planted this racial prejudice, which kind of continued on to the industrial era, when the immigrants who were here, some of whom had made some money, were willing to exploit the new immigrants coming in, try to break their unions, deny them entrance. We have a long history in this country of denying entrance to people of Asian stock. We kept out the Chinese with an Exclusion Act in 1882. 1907, we kept out Japanese coming here through a gentleman's agreement. We went into places and pitted one group against another so that they wouldn't be able to organize unions.
How can people obtain more information on your books, how to purchase them, or upcoming speaking engagements?
I have a website, and in my website, people will find excerpts from my 40 books, in particular on Black Indians, pictures, documents, and so on, articles that they can read for free. And also, I think there's a link there to Amazon or places you can order my books. I would just add one little thing, though. You had mentioned early on about the new edition of Black Indians. Please, anybody wanting to order the book should make sure they order the new edition. It's far more complete, has much more in it, including pictures, and includes a lot of things more in the current period that they'd find interesting.
It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show, sir. Thank you.
Pleasure to be on with you.
I'm the G-Man, and I thank you for joining me as well. Until next time, stay cool, stay safe, and stay informed.